Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to another compelling episode of the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and today we delve into a riveting chapter of American history with Smithsonian historian Jon Grinspan. As we explore the story of the Wide Awakes, you might not be familiar with this story. I wasn't, but this is just an extraordinary story of a political movement that shaped the trajectory of our nation in the tumultuous years leading up to the Civil War. Amazing, amazing story. Smithsonian Associate Jon Grinspan, a returning guest and Curator of Political History at the National Museum of American History for the Smithsonian Institute, will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. So please check out our show notes today for more details about Jon's upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation titled The Wide Awakes, the Forgotten Force That Spurred the Civil War. Jon will be joining us today to tell us about his new book, Wide Awake, and his presentation at Smithsonian Associates, so stay tuned. At the dawn of the 1860 presidential campaign, a small group of fervent young Northerners emerged to protect anti-slavery speakers from violent attacks. These individuals, calling themselves the Wide Awakes, quickly grew into a massive movement, attracting hundreds of thousands of young men and women from diverse backgrounds. They marched through cities with torchlit processions, their uniforms and disciplined formations, creating a striking visual spectacle that captured the nation's attention. We talk about this today with our guest, Jon Grinspan. But the impact of the Wide Awakes extended far beyond their impressive marches. They became a powerful symbol for the fight for majority rule, the defense of free speech, and the relentless push against the institution of slavery. Their efforts played a critical role in the election of Abraham Lincoln and set the stage for the seismic shifts that would soon engulf a nation at war, civil war.
I thought I'd start with an anecdote from a letter I found from the Montana Historical Society, from somebody writing about his experience with this movement. And it seemed like such an action-packed story that encapsulated so many trends and themes about this amazing movement that I started my book with it. And it's always my go-to example of what it felt like to live on the ground in 1860 and come across this movement as something new and exciting and inspiring and troubling all at the same time. And it begins with some quotes that are essentially in italics. Imagine these are being shouted by people, the first couple of lines. The speakers, the northern dogs, the speakers, the northern dogs. Let us have them. James Hanks Brisbane could hear the hollering and the hissing all around him. Shouts of abolitionists and stone them shuddered through the crowds outside his rattling carriage. Inside, Brisbane tried to go unnoticed, tucking his white hat low over his big green eyes. His only hope was to get out of Wheeling, Virginia, before they discovered him back over the bridge to the far side of the Ohio River. The rain poured and the carriage jostled. Across from Brisbane sat a rare anti-slavery Virginian who had invited the Pennsylvanian Republicans to come make a modest and moderate presentation of the claims of Abraham Lincoln 1 week before the 1860 election. The speeches had not lasted long. A huge crowd had mustered outside the lecture hall. Many were armed. They demanded, Brisbane was told while speaking on stage, that the northern speakers be handed over to them. His host snuck him out through a side door, but knew that they had to keep him out of sight. In a world where every clothing choice made a partisan declaration, the 23-year-old newspaper editor's long brown hair, his white hat, and his shawl all marked him distinctly as a northern abolitionist. As Brisbane's carriage reached the plaza before the bridge leading off Wheeling Island, a mass of struggling human beings blocked its path. Many more furious locals leaned out over balconies. Rumor had it that men were searching the city's hotels for him. The miserable rain pounded on the vehicle's roof. Through the darkness, Brisbane could make out the gaslights of the bridge, and beyond it, scores of strange golden glimmers, his fellow Republicans disappearing over the span towards Pennsylvania. He had no choice. He would have to run for it. Then Brisbane was out of the carriage, trying to move briskly but inconspicuously through the crowds. But his outfit gave him away. Just as he neared the great bridge's iron gate, a hand yanked him by his long hair. Another grasped at his shawl. Brisbane sprang forward, losing a fistful of hair and breaking his shawl's fastener. He wheeled halfway around and struck one of his pursuers in the face. Certain he was about to die, he dashed for the bridge. The structure before him was no shabby crossing. Wheeling's famous suspension bridge was the most sophisticated in the world, an inspiration for the future Brooklyn Bridge, 1,000 feet long, with tall towers of modeled stone shaped like huge archways and taut wires that stretched like fingers onto the river bluffs on either side. And now Brisbane was scrambling onto its well-lit span. As he began his sprint, he heard gunshots behind him. A strange tableau emerged before Brisbane as he pounded down the slick wooden boards. At the very focal point of his vision, between the gray bluffs, the muddy river, the converging suspension wires, and the stone arch, stood a squadron of men in black, 80 of them, looking statuesque in flared dark capes, dark greatcoats, dark trousers, and dark boots. Many held torches on long wooden staffs. Others clutched matte blue revolvers, flashing in the gloam. Their young faces were framed by soldiers' caps tucked low against the rain. Torchlight flickered off their shining capes, catching broad shoulders, stern stares, and full beards. At their head, a veteran officer kept them in a tight martial column. Some held banners with their stark symbol, an open, unblinking eye. They looked like soldiers. They looked like monuments. They looked like nothing that had been seen before in American politics. But to a panting James Hanks Brisbane, closing his 1,000-foot dash, they looked like salvation.
In today's episode, Smithsonian Associate Jon Grinspan takes us on a journey through his latest book, Wide Awakes, providing a nuanced examination of this influential movement. We'll uncover how the Wide Awakes visual strategies, this brand, some of the uniforms that they wore, their organizational prowess, their unwavering commitment to their cause, galvanized public opinion and reshaped the political landscape. We will also explore the dual perceptions of the Wide Awakes as both a beacon of hope for a rising majority and a potential paramilitary threat to the South. Join us as we delve into the rich history of the Wide Awakes again. You're going to love this story with returning guest Jon Grinspan drawing parallels to contemporary political movements and understanding the enduring legacy of their activism. Talking about the Wide Awakes now. This is an episode you won't want to miss, one that sheds light on the power of protest, the complexities of our democracy, and the indomitable spirit of those who dare to stand up for justice. Thanks for tuning in to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. Let's dive into this fascinating discussion with Smithsonian Associate Jon Grinspan. Smithsonian Associate Dr. Jon Grinspan, a returning guest to the program. Welcome back.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm such a fan.
Well, thank you for saying that. I'm a fan of yours. We talked previously about your wonderful book, The Age of Acrimony. Got a new book now. Wonderful. Just so timely. I can't wait to talk to you about this. Wide Awake is the title. About the Wide Awakes, a subject that I always learn so much from you. This one falls right into that category. You've so generously read a passage, but maybe tell us briefly what you're going to tell us at Smithsonian Associates, and in particular, how you'll use Zoom to engage our audience. We're all on Zoom these days.
Yep, that's right. And this is a very visual story, so it's good we're on Zoom. It works as a podcast too, of course.
Yeah.
This is the story of one of the largest, weirdest, and most consequential mass movements in American history, the Wide Awakes of the 1860 election. This is a grassroots youth anti-slavery movement that stood up against slavery in defense of democracy and moving to elect Abe Lincoln in the election right before the Civil War. And not only helps us understand democracy and politics and youth politics, but also how America ended up in a civil war, how an election turned into a war. And this movement, if you've heard of the Wide Awakes, you get excited when people mention them, but most people haven't. They're awfully obscure today, even though they're so consequential. So I'm hoping to teach people a little history and show them some incredible objects that we've collected at the Smithsonian and elsewhere that help tell this forgotten material story.
Yeah, as I say, I think this is going to be a wonderful presentation. The book, of course, is fabulous. I always enjoy this conversation with you, Jon, because I do learn a great deal in your role with Smithsonian in American history and your writing. But how did you come across this story? Because it really is a special one. And I guess from that initial research, what was it that inspired you to write Wide Awake?
Yeah, it's funny. I've been working on this story for 17 years. I started on them as a grad student. And what I liked about this story was that almost nobody had heard of them. They were so obscure and so distant from what American politics looked like. This kind of militaristic youth movement marching in the streets with good and bad elements of it. It seemed so foreign. And that's what I liked at first. Over the past 17 years, they've gone from foreign to relevant. And they look like a lot of the things that worry us about democracy and our politics today. So it's interesting to see how this history stays the same as we change over time. And also, because I've been just obsessed with this story for 17 years and I'm a curator of the Smithsonian, people reach out to me with objects, torches, capes, diary entries in their great uncle's diary, or people keep coming out of the woodwork to show me more new, interesting stuff about this movement. And so it felt like just because you think you're done with a story, just because you did it 17 years ago, doesn't mean it's done with you. And so I hope I'm doing the Wide Awakes justice now. And I won't have to write another book in 17 years about them as well.
Well, yeah, well, keep us posted about these upcoming books because I love talking to you. And 17 years is fine with me, but I have a feeling we're going to be talking sooner than that. Jon Grinspan is our guest today here on Smithsonian Associates interview series. I stumbled just a moment ago. I want to make sure and correct. Jon's title is Curator of Political History at the National Museum of American History. Jon, always great to talk to you. As a curator of political history, I found this book to be really so relevant for today, but also had this amazing applicability to our history around the election of Abraham Lincoln. So maybe tell us a little bit of the story about the Wide Awakes and the election that put Abraham Lincoln into office.
I think essentially everybody in America knows about Abe Lincoln and everyone knows there's a Civil War, and most people know it was over slavery. But how these things connect together, I think the ligature, like how do these events connect on the ground, is something that most people don't know. And the Wide Awakes help tell that story. They're a mass movement. They're started by teenagers, essentially. A 19-year-old starts the whole movement. This kid, Eddie Jurgensen in Hartford, kind of makes up a uniform one day and it starts to take off. And they start this cellular organization across the country of companies, militaristic companies of young men, sometimes young women, mostly white, some African-American, mostly native born, but some immigrants from really across the political spectrum who are organizing and marching at night with torches and rising up to defend democracy from slavery as they see it. They see slavery as a threat, not just a moral threat to the well-being of enslaved people, but also a threat to American democracy as a growing minority rule that is undermining the principles of free speech, of majority rule. And so they organize this mass movement, really a grassroots movement, to kind of protest in the streets and elect Abe Lincoln. And as I said, they're basically kids, teens, guys in their early 20s. And you can see the established leaders, the Abe Lincolns and the William Henry Sewards and the people in Washington trying to figure out how to navigate this relationship with this mass movement in the street. As we've seen in the last couple of years, when you see youth protesters, it can be awfully hard for the political establishment to figure out how to deal with them. So just watching that dynamic was fascinating for me.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially on the heels of some of the universities that have been occupied of late. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, this was a shrewd group. And as you were speaking just now, and as I was reading the book, I thought this was a group that seized on a moment, absolutely, but they almost had a brand unto themselves. Yeah. You referred to the uniforms. Tell us a little bit about the visual elements of this group, because it was really pretty impressive that they were pulling all this together.
Yeah, this is one of those things that it's not just some nebulous group. It's a branded, franchise, mass marketed movement. One of the first in American history. The guy who comes up with them originally works in a textile store. And a lot of the people who help spread it work in textile stores and salesmanship and advertising. And they create this movement that's anchored by a couple symbols and really easy to spread around the country. They wear these shiny black capes, initially to keep torch oil from falling on their clothing when they're at torchlit marches. But it kind of bleeds over into this militarism that's really compelling. They wear military hats and capes. They give themselves ranks and orders. They drill at military through drill books, basically rifle drills, are all with the sense that they're projecting order and civility and dignity and also toughness in a society that seems like it's increasingly chaotic. That American democracy is very bloody and aggressive back then. The nation seems as if it's spinning out. People keep talking about the irrepressible conflict, the sense that some kind of civil war is coming. And so the fact that these wide awakes in their uniforms, they're drilling together, can show a cohesive force is really compelling to people. The other symbol they use a lot is the open eye, like wide awake. The open eye is a symbol that you have on their signs and their banners and everything. And it really gets across a sense of a young generation waking up to something, that past Americans have tolerated slavery, tolerated the problems in American democracy, but these 20-year-old kids are waking up to it. And with those icons and with that really material grounding, they can really spread. They're comprehensible to people. You see a march of them and you understand them. And it turns out later, the guy who founds the movement at age 19 becomes one of America's most prominent designers later in life. He had the skill, he had the touch, and he started this movement as a kid. And later he redesigned the White House. So some of these things are skills that get passed down, I guess.
Hi, it's Paul. Do you love entertaining, informative, eclectic, insightful programs about culture, health, science, life, and everything Smithsonian? As part of our Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast, we're introducing you to the new Smithsonian Associates streaming series. Smithsonian, a nonprofit organization, is excited to present this new aspect of their 55 years as the world's largest museum-based educational program. Join us from the comfort of your home as we periodically interview Smithsonian Associate guest speakers. Our audience here on radio and podcast can explore our website for more information, links, and details at notold-better.com. Thanks, everybody. Dr. Jon Grinspan, Smithsonian Associate, is a returning guest here on the program with us. He's back again today to talk about his wonderful new book, Wide Awake. Jon Grinspan will be presenting at Smithsonian Associates coming up. We'll have links so that you can find out more information about Jon Grinspan and all of his work as Curator of Political History at the National Museum of American History. We love talking to you, Jon, and I want to be efficient, though, with your time and ask you a question about the efforts of the Wide Awakes to protect the free speech of those who were considered anti-slavery speakers, because they really did that, and they were able to do that very well. How did that in turn influence public opinion about this subject, and how did it even morph and change some of the political outcomes of the moment?
I should start by saying this is an era when free speech, especially on slavery and race, really is embattled. That we talk about free speech today, we often mean whether somebody will think poorly of you for saying something out loud, right? But in the 19th century, in the 1850s, in the run-up to the Civil War, people are killed and lynched and mobbed and persecuted for criticizing slavery. Newspaper offices are raided. Newspaper presses are thrown in rivers around the country. You can't necessarily stand up and say you oppose slavery. You certainly can in the South, and you often can in the North, without thinking that maybe some angry mob is going to come for you. This is common in America. There are 1,200 mobbings in this era, which is when some angry group attacks you for some kind of public reason, like your political beliefs. And there's a sense that more and more you can't say what's on your mind. The anti-slavery congressmen are caned and attacked in the Capitol. There's this growing sense of embattled speech. And if the Wide Awakes are standing up for one thing, it's the right to speak out against slavery. They don't necessarily they can't agree on what to do about slavery. Some people are abolitionists who want to end it tomorrow. Some people say it just shouldn't expand any further. But what they can all agree on is that free speech is a fundamental right of democracy. So they organize these clubs originally, honestly, as bodyguards and escorts, because there's so much street fighting, brawling, open political violence. The Wide Awakes are the guys in uniforms who protect Abe Lincoln and other speakers as they travel the country giving speeches about slavery, anti-slavery speeches. They're really the muscle at first, the political police, as they call themselves. They take off and they become so popular, and there's so many of them around the country that they become a mass movement in their own right. That's at the same time pushing this cause, entertainment for young people, community events. Some of the biggest of gatherings, especially in a rural country, are these Wide Awake rallies where you live in a small town of 100 people. And one night in October before the presidential election, 1,000 Wide Awakes march through your town. People turn out, they celebrate, they wave handkerchiefs and shoot fireworks. And this becomes a political event as much as it is a embattled form of speech. And that all ties together to make this a kind of a cultural phenomenon, so that by the time Lincoln is elected, there are people who are excited about Lincoln. I don't want to make it seem like there aren't, but a lot of people say this is the movement that defined this election. This is the thing historians will be talking about in the future. And of course, interestingly, most people don't even know they existed. So it's kind of our obligation to recover this amazing story.
Yeah, well, congratulations, because it is a fantastic story. Your research into it is marvelous. And so I'm just so impressed with it. Again, our guest is Dr. Jon Grinspan, who has written this wonderful new book, The Wide Awakes. We're talking to Jon today in anticipation of Jon's upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation. You'll find more about Jon and his work and his new book, Wide Awake, in our show notes today. The interesting thing, too, I think about the mob as it began to swell in size and became much more than just muscle, is it added women to the mix of this group. What impact did the women have on the goals of the Wide Awakes?
Absolutely. I mean, this is an era when women do not have the right to vote, but that doesn't mean they don't care about politics. And I think sometimes we forget that before women have the right to vote, we have this attitude as if they're sitting on the sidelines doing nothing, and nothing could be further from the case. Half the American population lives in the same country, reads the newspapers, argues the issues, watches as their brothers and their husbands and their sons go off and vote, and they have strong political beliefs too. And many of them have strong anti-slavery beliefs. So when this movement seems to be rising up, it's incredibly exciting. Women help organize the events. They're often the spectators at a lot of these rallies. I know this seems gendered and sexist to us, but if you read the diaries of these young ladies who attended these rallies, who helped organize, who are excited to see these, it felt like participation for them. They live in a world where they don't have the right to vote yet, but they're not willing to sit on their hands. They're doing everything within their capacity, within kind of the mores of the time, to make their voices heard. And sometimes for some of them, that means organizing a celebration after a Wide Awake march. But sometimes it means forming a club that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in Seneca Falls form a Wide Awake auxiliary at Mount Holyoke, what was then a seminary and what is now a college. They form a Wide Awake club and march around. And they're really pushing the boundaries of gender in amazing ways. I think it's both a testament to those women in the 19th century who were going to make their voices heard, even if they were denied the right to vote. It's also a testament to the modular structure of the Wide Awakes that works for so many different communities. That you have these young working class guys in Hartford, and you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you have fugitive slaves, you have recent immigrants, you have people who are living in the South but are anti-slavery. The structure they create is so loose and compelling, but striking, that it works as well for all these different populations. And that, I think, helped explain why they're so exciting to the people who like them and why they're so terrifying to the people who don't like them.
Mm-hmm. Because they might have even been considered at moments a paramilitary threat. We have some of that today.
Yes, they look, I mean, when I was working on this, sometimes, honestly, they looked like Black Lives Matter, and sometimes they look like the Proud Boys. Like, you can see, and there are elements of them that are troubling. I think one of the things I really like about the Wide Awake story is, at first, they seem like heroes. They seem like Caped Crusaders. Finally, somebody with muscle is standing up against slavery in America. On the other hand, the more you look, they militarize an election. They are terrifying to people who do not see eye to eye with them. And they really push the boundaries of where politics can go and what you can do with it before you're going too far. Where is the line between free speech and political violence? And so what I like about them is that they're kind of a challenging movement, that at some moments you like them and you're rooting for them. And at other moments, you're saying, these are guys in uniforms marching through the streets with torches in the middle of the night. No wonder they scared half the country.
In your research, what examples of some of the rhetoric that was used by the Wide Awakes and then used against the Wide Awakes that just escalated tensions?
Well, one of the interesting things is they lived with all the disinformation and misinformation we live with today. And I mean, one of the easiest examples of that is there are a couple African-American Wide Awake companies in places like Boston, Oberlin, Portland, Maine, and they're made up of fugitive slaves who want to get in on this, who organize their own clubs. And it's very brave of them to do that, right? They're living in an incredibly racist era. So for them to just participate, march in the street in uniforms is a bold move. But there's about maybe 250 of these guys in a movement of 250,000. 500,000 people. And yet when people learn that there are any African-American Wide Awakes, people, especially in the South, they say the whole movement is made up of African-Americans and they're organizing, they're plotting to take power from white people and they're going to invade the South. And so you see this, on the one hand, really interesting dynamic thing, which is African Americans in this partisan movement. And then on the other hand, you see how it turns into disinformation and spreads around the country. And you can almost see the wide awakes help us through the newspapers trace how ideas move around the country and how they get, almost like a game of telephone, how they get misinterpreted, how they get deliberately misrepresented by people who maybe want to scare people. It's a really interesting thing to watch it happen 150 years ago, because we know it happens today. But, if you step back in time 150 years, it's a very good way to trace how these things change over time.
So let's bring it current a little bit, because you mentioned the Proud Boys and you mentioned Black Lives Matters. What parallels did you draw between then and now in terms of protest and organization of modern political movements that we can learn and benefit from in terms of the story Wide Awake? Well,
I don't know if we can benefit from anything I learned. I go back and forth as a historian. Sometimes I think we can figure out secrets from the past that'll help us in the present. And sometimes I think these guys lived 200 years ago and they're interesting, but not informative. What I will say is that looking at the Wide Awake, you can see the ways that everything that makes them compelling also makes them dangerous, and how their militarism, their organization, their grassroots style, their youth, their momentum, their boldness, all of that makes them a really compelling mass movement and makes them exciting and helps Lincoln win the election. It also is exactly what scares people living in the South who see what they think is a paramilitary partisan force rising up in Connecticut and Wisconsin and California, and helps push people into secession. So I think we can see that similarly now. The way when you're in a political bubble, something can feel like a rising and can feel thrilling and can feel like you're finally standing up for yourself, can also look really dangerous to people outside that bubble. And I think I don't want to both sides this because I don't see moral equivalencies in everything, but I do think we can all know the feeling of seeing our own group doing something we're excited about and not necessarily seeing how it looks from people who live in another part of the country or disagree with us. And the Wide Awakes are a great way to do that, especially because we know one of these sides is supporting slavery. You don't have to support slavery to empathize with why a partisan force would look scary, right? Like, it's a good way to test some elements of this without others. I think that's the main thing. Also, the idea that democracy, on the one hand, calms us down, is it's designed to make us more peaceful exchange of power, that kind of thing. On the other hand, to win a campaign, you have to get people really amped up, and the Wide Awakes get people really fired up. And so there's kind of an inherent contradiction or tension or paradox in democracy, that the very thing that's supposed to make us behave better sometimes makes us behave worse.
Were the Wide Awakes just about youth and idealism, or did they have adults in the room at times? Did they get middle of the road?
That's a great question. I mean, there are all these amazing diary entries from these older politicians like William Henry Seward or Abe Lincoln or Carl Schurz, people who've been in the movement for decades. And they wake up in the middle of the night and Wide Awakes are outside of their house with torches and drums and they're trampling on their flowers. And on the one hand, these people have been fighting against slavery for decades. It's thrilling to have a bunch of 19-year-olds on their side. On the other hand, they're ruining their good night's sleep. They're trampling on their flowers. And they're scared too. There are a lot of people who are in the Republican Party, the party that's opposed to slavery expanding, that worry that the Wide Awakes are going to go too far, that they'll scare away moderates, that they'll intimidate people, that they'll be violent. And so you can see in their letters and their diaries this tension between, finally, for the first time in American history, an anti-slavery president and party is going to win this election. And on the other hand, this sense that was unprecedented before 1860. And then on the other hand, this sense that, well, maybe they'll push too far. Maybe they'll scare people off. Maybe they'll harm us in the process. I think that's something we see today. It's awfully difficult for people who've been in the field for decades to kind of play nicely with the people who are doing it for the first time. And the Wide Awakes kind of show that tension. And I think also, I hope this doesn't sound condescending. Any young activists out there, they're so motivated and they're so excited that they don't necessarily think about the knock-on effects of their actions. That afterwards, they all wrote memoirs and they said they builded better than they knew, which is to say they were so successful that they didn't realize that they were also engaging in some risky behavior, when at the time it just felt like this incredible spontaneous rising.
Dr. Jon Grinspan, Smithsonian Associate, Curator of Political History at the National Museum of American History, has been our guest today. Please check out our show notes for more information about Dr. Grinspan and his wonderful new book entitled Wide Awake. Just been such a great conversation. I could talk to you for a lot longer, John, and I hope you'll come back. The book is getting rave reviews. And I want to just mention Elizabeth Varon's review, because she says Grinspan's brilliant account of the Wide Awakes bristles with contemporary relevance. The dramatic story of this forgotten movement illuminates the militarism and violence, the passion and paranoia in our politics, here brought to vivid life in the pageant of American democracy in all its captivating complexity. What a, just a wonderful review. Couldn't be more accurate, Jon, about your wonderful book. Thanks for joining us today. Good luck and congratulations on this book. We'll look forward to seeing you at Smithsonian Associates.
Oh, thank you, Paul. I look forward to it. Thanks for speaking with me.
Always. My thanks to Smithsonian Associate Jon Grinspan, a returning guest and curator of political history at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institute. Jon Grinspan will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up, so please check out our show notes today for more information about Jon Grinspan's upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation titled The Wide Awakes, the Forgotten Force That Spurred the Civil War. My thanks to the Smithsonian team for all they do to support the show. My thanks always to executive producer Sam Hanniger for his sound design and all his work on the show. And my thanks to you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Please be well, be safe, and let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. To find out more about all of today's stories or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show.
Hi, one final thing. Please check out our website for this episode and all episodes at notold-better.com or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out your local radio stations to find out more about the Not Old Better Show on podcast and radio. You can find us all over social media. Our Twitter feed is Not Old Better, and we're on Instagram at Not Old Better too. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelsang, and I hope you'll join me again next time to talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.